There is something the narcissist is reaching for in every intimate relationship they enter. Beneath all the performance, and the control, and the behavior that makes genuine closeness so difficult to sustain with them. It is not admiration, though they pursue admiration relentlessly. It is not dominance, though they consistently seek it. It is not even the supply that most psychological frameworks use to explain narcissistic behavior, though supply is the closest most people get to naming what is actually happening. What the narcissist craves, at the deepest and most inaccessible layer of their psychology, is something far more fundamental than any of these things. It is the experience of being fully known, and fully accepted anyway. Not accepted despite their flaws in the conditional way that most human relationships offer. Acceptance. Not tolerated in exchange for their charm or their status, or the particular intensity they bring to a relationship in its early stages, but accepted at the level of the self that exists beneath the performance, the self that was rejected or inadequately received so early and so completely that it was buried under layers of constructed identity before the person had the psychological vocabulary to even understand what was being lost. That buried self has been waiting, in every relationship the narcissist has ever entered, for someone to find it, to see it clearly, including all its wound and inadequacy and unmet need, and to remain. This is the craving that cannot be spoken. Not because the narcissist is choosing silence about it strategically, though the silence serves strategic functions, but because the craving exists at a depth that the narcissist's own conscious awareness cannot reliably access. The constructed self, the grandiose, managed, performance-oriented identity that was built specifically to ensure that the real self would never again be exposed to the vulnerability of being known and rejected, does not know how to articulate what lies beneath it. It was built to conceal precisely this. To confess the craving would require dismantling, at least temporarily, the entire structure that was built to protect against what the original exposure produced. And so the craving expresses itself sideways. Through testing, the narcissist persistent, often unconscious, pushing against the limits of another person's tolerance, which is at its core an attempt to discover whether someone will stay, even when the less constructed version of their behavior is on display. Through the idealization of new partners, which is not really about the partner at all, but about the hope that this time, with this person, the real self might finally find what it has always needed. Through the devastation that follows, when intimacy reaches the point where the real self would have to show up authentically, and the narcissist destroys the relationship, rather than risk the exposure that genuine closeness would require. The tragedy embedded in this craving is precise and worth sitting with honestly. The narcissist spends their entire relational life pursuing, at the deepest level, the one thing their psychology makes it almost completely impossible to receive, because receiving it would require them to stop performing, to lower the constructed identity long enough for the real self to be seen. And that lowering, that terrifying moment of genuine exposure, is the exact thing the entire defensive structure was built to prevent at any cost. Every relationship they destroy, every moment of genuine intimacy they sabotage, every person who gets close enough to almost reach the real self, and then finds themselves suddenly on the outside looking in, all of it circles back to this one unarticulated, unexamined, desperately persistent craving, to be known, completely, and loved, not despite it, but because of it. And the saddest part is that they will never ask for it directly, because asking would mean admitting it exists, and admitting it exists would mean the wall comes down. There is a pattern in how narcissists manage the distance between themselves and the people they are closest to that becomes visible once you know what to look for. It is not random emotional unavailability. It is not simply the selfishness of someone who prioritizes their own comfort over their partner's need for connection. It is something more specific and more psychologically purposeful than either of those. Explanations accounts for a continuous, vigilant management of how close another person is allowed to get, how long they are permitted to remain at that proximity, and precisely when the distance needs to be re-established before something becomes visible that the narcissist cannot afford to have seen. The need to control intimacy originates in a specific fear that sits at the center of the narcissist's psychology and operates in every close relationship they form, regardless of how different those relationships appear on the surface. It is the fear of being known at a depth that precedes the constructed identity. The fear that if someone gets close enough For long enough, with genuine enough perception, they will see behind the performance, and what they find there will confirm the narcissist's deepest and most carefully concealed belief about themselves. That beneath the confidence and the charisma and the carefully managed image is a self that is fundamentally inadequate, empty in some essential way, not worthy of the love that the performance has been securing in its place. Intimacy, in its genuine form, is the process through which people become known to each other at exactly this depth. It requires time, sustained presence, and a quality of mutual vulnerability that allows both people to be seen past their social performance and into their actual interior lives. For most people, this process, while sometimes frightening, is also deeply desired. The experience of being truly known and remaining loved is one of the most fundamentally healing things a human relationship can provide. But for the narcissist, whose constructed identity was built specifically to prevent this kind of exposure, genuine intimacy is not experienced as an opportunity. It is experienced as a threat. Every increment of closeness represents a corresponding increment of danger. The closer someone gets, the more the gap between the presented self and the actual self risks becoming visible. The more time spent in sustained, genuine contact with another person, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the performance at the level of consistency the narcissist depends on. Cracks appear. Inconsistencies accumulate. The real self, however buried, exerts pressure from below the constructed surface in ways that become increasingly difficult to manage the more deeply intimate the relationship becomes. The control the narcissist exerts over intimacy is their management of this pressure. Closeness is allowed up to the point where the pressure becomes dangerous, up to the threshold where the real self might become visible. Then something shifts. Emotional withdrawal, provocation that creates distance through conflict, a sudden devaluation of the partner that repositions them outside the zone of genuine intimacy, an introduction of a new dynamic that resets the relationship to a less threatening level of closeness. All of these behaviors, however different they appear in their specific forms, serve the same fundamental function, maintaining the distance required to keep the constructed self safely intact. Understanding this reframes something important for anyone who has experienced the bewildering intimacy cycle with a narcissistic partner. The withdrawal was never about you losing value in their eyes. The distance was never evidence of diminishing care. It was always, only, about how close you were getting to something they were not ready for anyone to see. There is a particular kind of testing that happens in narcissistic relationships that most people on the receiving end experience as cruelty, as unpredictability, as the narcissist simply being destructive, without reason or pattern. And while the impact is genuinely cruel, and the behavior is genuinely destructive, it is not without pattern. It is not random. It is the narcissist's unconscious attempt to answer a question they cannot ask directly. The question that underlies every intimate relationship they have ever formed. The question that was never adequately answered in their earliest experience of being close to another person. The question of whether they will be loved when they stop performing. The craving for unconditional acceptance in the narcissist is so deep and so thoroughly connected to their original wound that it functions less like a desire and more like a biological need, persistent, urgent, and impossible to fully satisfy through the means available to them within their current psychological structure. It was formed in an environment where love was contingent, where the child learned, through the specific quality of care they received or failed to receive, that being loved required something from them, required performance, achievement, compliance, the suppression of certain emotional states, the presentation of a version of self that the environment could receive, and the version that was not acceptable, the needy, confused, frightened, ordinarily inadequate version that every child embodies in their most vulnerable moments, was met with withdrawal, criticism, or absence. The narcissist never stopped needing what that child needed, to be seen in their full, imperfect, unperforming humanity, and to find that the love was still there. They simply lost conscious access to the need, as the constructed self was built over it. And the craving, driven underground but never resolved, expresses itself through the testing behavior that so often defines the worst periods of a narcissistic relationship. The pushing, the provocations, the escalation of behavior that seems designed to drive the other person away. Because on the level where the craving lives, that is exactly what this behavior is testing. Whether the other person will leave when the performance drops, whether the love that has been offered is genuinely unconditional, or whether it too will prove to be contingent on a version of the narcissist that the narcissist cannot sustain indefinitely. Here is where the dynamic becomes its most tragic, and it's most difficult to witness clearly. When the other person passes the test, when they stay through the difficult behavior, when they continue to offer care despite the provocation, when they demonstrate in action that their love is not contingent on the narcissist performing at their best, the narcissist does not receive this as the answer they were looking for. Instead, something strange happens. The evidence of unconditional acceptance, rather than resolving the craving, intensifies it, because unconditional acceptance feels, to the part of the narcissist that does not believe they deserve it, like a dangerous thing to rely on, like something that could be revoked the moment the person offering it fully understands who they are actually accepting. And so instead of resting in it, the narcissist escalates, tests harder, pushes further, tries, at an unconscious level, to finally find the limit of the acceptance, to discover the point at which the love becomes conditional, which would confirm what they have always believed, and return them to the familiar, if painful, territory of a world organized around performance. And when the person finally does leave, not because they do not love the narcissist, but because the testing eventually becomes unsustainable, the narcissist experiences it as confirmation of the original wound. The very craving that was driving the test ensured the test could never be passed. There is something in the narcissist's relational psychology that runs completely counter to the image they project into the world, and it is one of the most carefully concealed and least discussed aspects of what they actually need from intimate relationships. The image they project is one of self-sufficiency, dominance, and the particular kind of confidence that requires nothing from anyone. The person who is always the most capable in the room, always the one setting the terms, always the one whose approval others seek, rather than the one who needs approval themselves. This image is maintained with considerable effort and considerable consistency, and yet underneath it, in the space where genuine psychological needs live rather than performed ones, there is a craving that directly contradicts everything the image is designed to communicate. The narcissist secretly needs the other person to be stronger than them, not stronger in the aggressive sense, not stronger in a way that competes with or threatens the narcissist, public image of dominance, but stronger in a specific, interior sense, psychologically grounded in a way the narcissist is not, stable in a way the narcissist cannot sustain, capable of remaining solid and unshaken in the face of behavior that is precisely designed, even if unconsciously, to test whether that solidity is real. The narcissist needs, at the level they cannot articulate, someone who will not collapse under the weight of who they are, someone who cannot be controlled into a smaller version of themselves, someone who sees through the performance, not with contempt, but with a steady, clear-eyed recognition that does not require the narcissist to keep performing in order to maintain the relationship. This need exists because of what the narcissist actually experienced in the relationship that formed them. In most cases, the early environment that produced the narcissistic adaptation involved a caregiver who was, in some crucial way, psychologically fragile themselves, who required the child to manage their emotional state, to perform in ways that protected the caregiver's self-image, to become small or impressive or invisible depending on what the caregiver needed in any given moment. The child learned that the people they depended on were not actually solid enough to be depended on, that their own well-being was, in some fundamental sense, responsible for the emotional stability of the person who was supposed to be providing stability to them. The adult narcissist carries this template into every intimate relationship, and the dynamic they create, the testing, the demands, the emotional volatility, is in part an attempt to discover whether this person is different, whether this relationship will be one in which they can finally encounter something they never do in the original environment, a presence that is genuinely stable, that does not require management, that will not crumble or retaliate or become destabilized when the narcissist is at their most difficult. What makes this dynamic so complicated is what happens when they actually find this quality in tonal. Because the partner who demonstrates genuine psychological strength, who maintains their own groundedness in the face of the narcissist's behavior, who does not collapse into compliance or retaliate into cruelty, but simply remains steady, produces in the narcissist a response that seems paradoxical from the outside. The strength that was craved becomes threatening. The solidity that was needed becomes something to attack. Because a person who cannot be destabilized is also a person who cannot be controlled. And for the narcissist, encountering something they need that they cannot control creates a level of psychological tension that their defensive system responds to as danger. They spend their lives searching for the person solid enough to hold them, and then dismantling that person for being exactly what they were looking for. There is a hunger at the center of the narcissist's pursuit of admiration that most people never fully understand, because they stop at the surface of what admiration appears to provide. The assumption is straightforward. The narcissist wants to feel superior, wants to be told they are exceptional, wants the ongoing confirmation that they are more impressive than the people around them. And while all of that is present, it is not the root. The admiration the narcissist pursues so relentlessly is not actually about superiority at all. It is a substitute, an imperfect, ultimately unsatisfying substitute for something far more specific and far more intimate that they cannot bring themselves to seek directly. What the narcissist is actually looking for when they demand admiration is genuine mirroring, not the mirroring of their achievements or their image or the carefully constructed version of themselves they present to the world, but the mirroring of the self that exists beneath all of that, the authentic, unperforming, undefended self that was never adequately reflected back to them in the environment that shaped them. Every child needs to see themselves accurately reflected in the eyes of their earliest caregivers, needs to look up and find, in the face and responses of the person who matters most to them, a clear and loving recognition of who they actually are. When this mirroring is adequate, the child develops a stable, grounded sense of self that does not require constant external confirmation to remain intact. When it is inadequate, when the caregivers could not or would not provide this quality of reflection, the child is left with a self that feels unstable, uncertain, and perpetually in need of external confirmation to feel real. The narcissist's adult pursuit of admiration is the continuation of this unmet, developmental need through the only channels their constructed psychology makes available. They cannot ask for genuine mirroring because genuine mirroring requires the authentic self to be present and visible, and the authentic self has been buried beneath the constructed identity for so long that accessing it deliberately feels impossible. So instead, they seek the closest available substitute, the admiring response of people around them, the confirmation that the image they are presenting is being received as impressive, the ongoing external signal that they exist and matter and are seen. But here is the fundamental problem with admiration as a substitute for genuine mirroring. It never reaches the part of the narcissist that actually needs to be reflected. Admiration lands on the constructed self, the performance, the image, and the constructed self, however elaborate and however convincing, is not the self that needs to be seen. Every compliment, every expression of admiration, every moment of being treated as exceptional, all of it feeds the performance while leaving the authentic self beneath it, exactly as unseen as before. This is why the admiration never satisfies the need it appears to be serving. The more admiration the narcissist receives, the more they need, not because they are simply greedy, but because what they are receiving is landing in the wrong place. The hunger persists because the hunger is not for what is being offered. This creates a cycle that the narcissist cannot break from within their current psychological structure, a perpetual pursuit of something that is definitionally unable to provide what they are actually looking for, through a channel that forecloses access to the only thing that could. The admiration they collect is not the mirror they need. It is the echo of a self they constructed to survive the absence of one, and no amount of echo will ever substitute for being genuinely seen. There is a paradox embedded in the narcissist's relationship to control that becomes visible in intimate relationships in a way it does not in any other context. In every other area of their life, professional environments, social settings, the carefully managed dynamics of their public relationships, the narcissist pursuit of control is relatively straightforward. Control is power, power is safety, and safety is the only reliable substitute they have found for the genuine emotional security they never developed in their earliest relational environment. But in intimacy, something more complicated happens. Because in intimacy, alongside the relentless drive to control, there exists a craving that points in the completely opposite direction. A deep, persistent, almost desperate longing to stop controlling, to surrender, to be in the presence of another person and feel, for once, that the management of everything can be set down. This longing for surrender is not something the narcissist can typically access consciously, and it is almost never something they can articulate. It exists beneath the layers of defensive structure as one of the most fundamental unmet needs of their entire psychological life. Because the exhaustion of maintaining control, of continuously monitoring the environment, managing other people's perceptions, sustaining the performance of the constructed self, across every relationship and every context, is profound and cumulative in a way the narcissist rarely acknowledges even to themselves. The person who appears most in control in every room they enter is often the person most privately exhausted by the requirement of being so. What they crave in the deepest and most inaccessible layer of their intimate relationships is the experience of simply being held, not physically necessarily, but psychologically. Being in a space with another person where the performance is not required, where the constructed self can be set aside without catastrophic consequence, where the exhaustion of being who they have always had to be in the world can briefly, safely, be released. This is what surrender, in its healthiest form, actually means in intimate relationships. The willingness to stop performing and simply be. And for the narcissist, who built an entire psychological architecture around the impossibility of this, it is the most longed for and the most terrifying thing that intimacy seems to offer. The terror is specific, because surrender, even temporary surrender, even the small and quiet kind that simply means being present without performance, requires an exposure of the authentic self that the narcissist, entire psychology was constructed to prevent. To stop controlling the intimate environment, even briefly, is to risk being seen without the construction. And being seen without the construction risks encountering, in another person's response, the rejection that the construction was built to prevent. The original wound, the experience of the authentic self being inadequate, being too much, being not enough, being something the early environment could not fully receive, lives in the place where surrender would require the narcissist to stand. And the proximity to that wound, even in a moment of genuine safety, can feel like genuine danger. So the craving and the terror operate simultaneously, and in direct opposition to each other. The narcissist is drawn toward the surrender they need, and repelled by the exposure it requires. In a cycle that produces one of the most painful dynamics in intimate relationships, the person who draws close when they feel in control, and punishes their partner when the closeness produces the first instinct of genuine surrender. They punish the person who almost gave them what they most need, because almost is close enough to feel dangerous, but not close enough to feel safe. And the punishment ensures the almost never becomes what it could have been. There is something that exists in the narcissist psychology that virtually no one who has been hurt by one is prepared to hear, and that the virtually narcissists themselves would almost certainly deny with considerable force if it were ever named directly to them. It is the longing, buried, unacknowledged, and expressed only in the most indirect and often destructive ways, to be held accountable, not punished, not shamed or condemned or publicly exposed in the way that the word accountability sometimes implies in our cultural conversation, but held by someone whose presence communicates, without cruelty and without collapse, that the behavior the narcissist produces has impact, that the impact is real, and that the relationship can absorb the honest acknowledgement of this without either person being destroyed by it. This longing emerges from the same original environment that produced everything else in the same's narcissist's psychological structure, because in almost every case, the early relational world of the narcissist was one in which accountability was either weaponized or absent. Either they were held responsible for things in ways that were shaming, disproportionate, or designed to serve the emotional needs of the caregiver rather than the developmental needs of the child, which produced the learned association between accountability and humiliation that makes genuine accountability feel so threatening as an adult. or accountability was never present at all. The environment was one in which behavior had no consistent consequences, where the child learned that nothing they did produced a clear and honest response from the people around them. In either case, what was missing was the experience of being held accountable by someone who remained loving through the accountability. Someone who could say, clearly and without cruelty, this is what happened, this is the impact, and I am still here. This is the specific form of accountability the narcissist secretly craves and consistently destroys the possibility of receiving. Because to be held accountable by someone who remains loving is to experience something that the original environment never provided. The evidence that the authentic self, including all its mistakes and damage and imperfection, is something that can be witnessed honestly without the relationship ending. It is the most intimate possible form of being known, and for the narcissist whose psychology is organized entirely around preventing exactly this, my kind of knowing, it is simultaneously the thing most longed for and the thing most systematically dismantled. The person in a relationship with a narcissist who holds them accountable, calmly, clearly, without either collapsing in hurt or escalating into cruelty, initially produces in the narcissist a response that is startling in its intensity. The anger, the retaliation, the immediate work of reframing the accountability as an attack is not simply defensiveness in the ordinary sense. It is the narcissist's entire psychological defense system activating in response to the most direct threat it knows, the threat of genuine exposure in the context of genuine care. Because this combination, exposure and care together, is what the original wound told them was impossible. When a person nevertheless persists in offering this combination, when they maintain both, their honesty and their care in the face of the reaction, something extraordinary sometimes happens beneath the narcissist's defensive response. Not always visible on the surface, not always acknowledged, then or ever, but present. A quality of being, briefly, genuinely seen, in a way that the construction was built to prevent, and finding that the sky did not fall. Most narcissists will destroy the relationship before they allow this experience to be complete. But the part of them that longed for it will remember that it almost happened, and that almost is the closest most of them will ever come to the thing they needed most. There is a conclusion that this entire conversation has been building toward, and it is one that requires a particular kind of honesty to fully absorb, both for the people who have been in relationship with narcissists, and for anyone who wants to understand the psychology completely rather than simply at the level that feels most immediately satisfying, because the most natural place to land, after understanding everything the narcissist craves and cannot ask for, is the question of whether the right person, with the right love, with the right combination of strength and patience and genuine care, could give the narcissist what they need, could reach the buried self, could provide the unconditional acceptance, the genuine mirroring, the steady accountability, the safe surrender that everything in their psychology is organized around not receiving. And the honest answer to that question is the hardest thing in this entire conversation to hear. No, another person cannot give the narcissist what they actually need, not because those things are not genuinely needed, not because the people who have tried were insufficient in their love, or their capacity, or their willingness to remain through difficulty, but because what the narcissist needs is not something that can be delivered from the outside, into a psychology that is structurally designed to prevent its arrival. Consider what genuine healing would actually require for the narcissist. It would require, first, the conscious acknowledgement that the constructed self is a construction, that the identity they have inhabited and defended and organized their entire life around is not who they actually are, but a survival adaptation built over who they actually are. This acknowledgement is not simply intellectually difficult. It is psychologically catastrophic for the defensive structure that the constructed self was built to protect. Every mechanism that keeps the narcissist functioning, the grandiosity, the externalization of fault, the control of intimacy, the pursuit of admiration, the inability to sustain genuine accountability, all of it exists specifically to prevent this acknowledgement from occurring. Another person's love, however genuine, cannot dismantle a defensive structure that was built to be impervious to exactly this kind of approach. What healing the narcissist's core wound actually requires is something that can only come from within their own psychology. arrived at through a process that no external relationship can substitute for or shortcut. It requires the narcissist to become willing, genuinely willing, not performatively so, to turn toward the buried self with something other than defense, to tolerate the anxiety of genuine self-examination without immediately converting that anxiety into blame, projection, or the reconstruction of a more elaborate version of the same defense, to remain present with their own interior experience, including the shame and the emptiness and the wound, long enough for something real to be accessed. This is work that belongs entirely to them. It cannot be done for them by a loving partner who stays through everything. It cannot be done by understanding from the outside what drives the behavior. It cannot be done by the right combination of intimacy and patience and care, however beautifully and consistently offered. Because the barrier between the narcissist and their own healing is not the absence of someone who loves them enough. It is the presence of a psychological architecture they have not yet chosen to examine, and that examination can only be initiated from the inside. This is not a reason to abandon compassion for what the narcissist carries. The wound is real. The craving is real. The exhaustion of a life lived entirely on the surface of the self is real and profound, and deserves to be acknowledged honestly. But compassion for what someone carries is not the same as the ability to carry it for them. That work has always been theirs, and until they choose it, every person who loves them will eventually learn that love alone was never going to be enough.